Well, what exactly does a president do? Well, most first-time voters in Singapore understand the roles and the functions of an elected president, but they're less clear about his or her working relationship with Parliament. Now, that's according to a survey by CNA and TODAY, which saw responses from over 1,500 citizens aged 21 to 33. Now, let's take a look at some of those findings. First, over 80% of Singaporeans are aware of the president's role, and that is to safeguard the national reserves and grant approval for the government to access those funds. Now, about three-quarters of Singaporeans are aware of that. Should the president refuse to give access, the parliament can still overturn his or her decision. And when it comes to investigations on corrupt practices or detention of individuals deemed a security threat, well, most are aware that the president can overrule the government's decision. Now, most Singaporeans are also aware that while the president can veto certain decisions by the government, the head of state cannot advance his or her own policy agenda. They also know that the president is the final approver for key appointments within the public sector and government-linked companies. However, almost half of the citizens are unaware that the president has no power to change existing laws. Some Singaporeans remain confused about the president's relationship with the cabinet and parliament. Around two-thirds of Singaporeans know that the president generally takes instructions only from the cabinet, but not from the parliament. Both the cabinet and the parliament also don't report to the president. One observer says not enough is being done to educate the public on how the president works with the cabinet. And she adds that it is the basic right and responsibility of Singaporeans to make informed decisions on who they feel is suitable for the role.
And Dr. Gillian Koh joins us now to talk us through all the nuances of this topic. Dr. Gillian Koh is a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies at NUS.
Hi.
Now, Dr. Koh, I'm quoting you on this. So we have to remember the president, on the whole, acts on the advice of the government, except for a small clutch of custodial powers. And most of us don't understand the finer points of that. What are those custodial powers? When does it listen? When does it not? If you could explain that to us.
Well, okay, let's start off by saying that the president always acts on the advice of cabinet in what he or she does day to day. But in 5 areas, the president acts on his or her own discretion, and this is referred to as the 5 custodial powers. The first, I think your survey shows people understand this, the ability to veto government and government agencies' plans that will touch on using the country's past reserves. The second, to veto and put aside appointments that the government might propose for roles in very senior roles in the public sector and the legal service and so on. Third has to do with the ability to sanction investigations by the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau should the Prime Minister refuse to authorize that in a request from the Director of CPIB. Fourth has to do with the Internal Security Act. So when the Internal Security Act's Advisory Committee says that they would like to release a detainee, the President, that might be against the government's position, then the President gets to weigh in on that decision. And the fifth one is that the President has right to vary or veto a restraining order if the Cabinet's position is different from the position of the Presidential Council on religious harmony. So those are the 5 custodial roles. And I think key thing is that a lot of your respondents to the survey got those answers right. But what is the problem is that they weren't entirely clear about how the president relates to cabinet and also how the president relates to parliament. So the answers suggest that at least half believe that the president can direct or instruct the cabinet in what it does. That's untrue. And then only a third understood that the president does not take instruction from parliament, and only a half know that the president does not then instruct parliament. So these are different bodies, and we've got to understand that in the main, the president acts on the advice of government. Actually, he or she does what the government wants based on the policy framework, even when he or she is a diplomat, super diplomat representing us. Discussions on bilateral relations are directed by the government. And it's only on those 5 areas, in those 5 areas, primarily, that the president acts on his or her discretion.
These gaps that
Yes.
you've just very clearly explained, or misunderstandings that you've explained, they're quite important because it can impact the voting should it go to a contested poll.
Yeah, yes, indeed. I think what we want to be careful of, since we're citizens, we have the right and responsibility to vote. We also have the responsibility to understand what we're choosing the candidate for. And if we don't do that, candidates can oversell the role, and therefore we'll be going to the polling stations using incorrect criteria to decide who's suitable. So I think if we understand those custodial roles, we understand that financial competency is very important, and that's why it's one of those eligibility criteria. But there's also the question of character, the commitment to Singapore's security. Those are important. But what is not possible is really to pick someone who outwardly says, I will be there to contradict the government and what it does. So just always remember, there's a very unique role where, the president acts on the advice of government, except in those 5 areas that we mentioned. So that's how you go to the polls, understanding those constraints, limitations, or those special powers.
Right. It is our responsibility as voters to exercise our vote with knowledge.
Yes.
It is also the responsibility of any presidential hopeful to make it very clear what we are voting for.
Sure, indeed. But there's also something called, of course, the Elections Department, which is in charge of preparing for elections, presidential election, and managing it. And it puts out information about what the role is, how the election is conducted. So I would just say that maybe it's still too early, but it's really important that it puts out valuable, summarized, very accessible information about the role of the president, and do it in various languages, push it out on social media, get the right people to offer accurate, but
very
accessible
that,
information.
Since you mentioned it, it's early days yet.
Yes.
But how would you assess the efforts so far?
Well, I think first in terms of the candidates, you'll see that there's already a discussion about what it means to be independent and whether it's important to be independent. Independent of what? And I think the key question there is, even when you look at eligibility, even former cabinet ministers qualify, which says something that there is not independence of party that's important. I understand why it is an issue, because I think if we look at the genesis of the elected presidency, there was a lot of talk about a president checking on a rogue government, but in this specific area of managing of reserves. So I think we've got to wind that back a little bit and be a bit more precise in what the president can do.
I think we've got time for one more question. So I wanted to ask you about the number of younger first-time presidential voters that will be coming to the fore. How can the hopefuls appeal to this particular crowd?
Yeah. I think it's also important to bear in mind we've not had that many elections. So we've seen it in 1993. We last saw it in 2011. And of course, there are younger voters and new voters. And so I think it's quite important to get that accurate information out, which is accessible. It's important for candidates to stick to the role that they're contesting for, and be quite responsible in what they express and put of themselves. But I think there are also third parties. Certainly, there's the election department as an agency. So everywhere that we have information and even microsites of media platforms, we should make sure that there is the too long don't read version of what this role is about and how to think about selecting the right candidate.
Well, we do want to thank you for coming in.
Sure, my pleasure.
And
lovely
explaining
speaking to you
it
again.
to us. We've been joined by Dr. Gillian Koh, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies at NUS.